Okay, folks, welcome back. Today I want to look at mankind and the way that people look at history. It's very interesting to see the different patterns that people often follow. Now, the Bible actually shows that Adam was made sophisticated. He was able to read and write and speak, and you can find quite a lot of evidence that in fact he was the one who wrote the early chapters of Genesis. They may have been redacted or translated and updated by Moses at a later date into a language fitting for his own time, but nevertheless the original versions came from Adam. And it's interesting to see how in fact man is often portrayed as being some kind of a caveman. In even biblical teachings, early man is seen as primitive man, but in the Bible, early man is sophisticated. Okay, it's also interesting to see that with most historians, they consider or they assume that man started off as a primitive with stone tools and then discovered soft metals like bronze and then superior metals like iron, and so there's a development throughout history, whereas in fact the Bible says right in the early days, even within the lifetime of Adam, there were workers of iron. There was a man who worked iron. And it's interesting that one of the possible sites for Noah's Ark in the Ararat range of mountains, there's been pieces of titanium found, and there have been various attempts to explain how those got there, but it's quite possible, if you're a Bible believer, just to believe, well, they had titanium in the early days, because early man was sophisticated, and that's not a problem to us. It's a problem to those who believe in evolution, because they think, well, something that's thousands of years old can't have titanium in. Titanium's a modern alloy, and so therefore it can't be in this ancient archaeology. But it's not a problem to us. It's one of those things that they struggle. It's one of those OOPARTS that we've spoken of. And of course, OOPARTS are these out-of-place artifacts, these puzzles which disrupt the natural assumptions of evolutionary thinking, okay? Because it's beyond modern technology, just like the pyramids. You look at the pyramids and you can see that they were not built by primitive men, okay? There are lots of attempts to explain how else they might have been developed. If man was primitive, then perhaps they were built by aliens. The jury's out on that one. The Bible doesn't say that there are aliens. It does say that there were giants, the Hebrew Nephilim in Genesis 6, which literally means fallen ones, and they're described as men of renown. It could be that they were much bigger and maybe of a different level of intelligence, but there's no reason to believe necessarily that man was primitive in those days. There's no evidence of that in the Bible. Okay, there's a few bits of evidence that there were giants in the land. There's this footprint which is 18 inches long. Compare it to your own foot. A normal man has a foot which is 12 inches long, a foot, or thereabouts, and so a large foot like this is very big. But of course there are actually normal modern human beings who do have feet this big. There are basketball players and such like that are 8 or so feet tall, and they have big feet. So it's not completely without the realms of normal experience. We don't have to think, oh, giants, that means something really spooky or fantastic. There are people around today. You can see them on the TV. You can go and watch them play, and these men are huge, but they're few and far between. But the thought that there was a whole race of them is quite an intriguing one. But that seems to be something that the Bible does talk about. This is a cross-section of that footprint, just to prove to you that it's not a carved footprint, it's not a forgery. It is actually something that was formed in the natural sediment when it was soft. Okay, now according to evolutionary thinking, primates, like monkeys or of some sort, became intelligent slowly. They lost their hair, stood upright, started using tools, grunts became words, and so on and so forth. And so you've got this sort of idea that man has developed, and that would mean that we are the pinnacle of humanity now. We're the best that there has ever been. Heaven help us. And because we're more sophisticated than our ancestors, who were like cavemen who sat around and beat each other over the head with stones. And the thing is, there's this idea that we've come from primitive tools, stones, up to modern day computers and technology. And so there's this linear development of mankind that is imposed on the archaeology, and this is a problem with the OOPARTS, because you've got this line that sort of goes in a straight line all the way along, and you go from sort of Neanderthals at the bottom end to modern man at the top. And the problem with that is that it's probably a little bit too simplistic. It's probably a little bit too simplistic. Of course, anybody who does believe in this will say it's slightly more complicated. Of course, there will be certain points at which they went through certain developments, the discovery of fire, the discovery of the wheel. It might have, been improvements in technology and that kind of stuff. But gradually, as they discovered more and more things, and you have certain stages which are set up on this line, like the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. When archaeologists dig down, if they find bronze tools, they say, oh, this is Bronze Age. If they dig further down and they find that the bronze is gone and there's just tools made of flint, then they say this is Stone Age. And so the deeper you dig, the more primitive the stuff becomes. That's their assumption, and so if they dig up some houses or whatever else and some foundations made of stone, and there are bits of iron in there, then they say, oh, this is the Iron Age, this is later. So there's a little bit more complication to it than just man developing in a straight line, because of course there would be little leaps. There would be, such as the discovery of bronze, there would be a leap in man's technology as they spread around, and so there are certain things, and so it's not as simple as a straight line. It would be a little bit more complicated. But as you start to look at this, then you start to realize that there are certain things which just don't quite fit. How is it that when man was coming out of the Stone Age and into the Bronze Age, he discovered copper and was coming out of the caves and starting to plant crops, all of a sudden he could build pyramids which are so big that they were the tallest buildings on earth for centuries, even up to modern times. Pyramids that are so accurate in their leveling that they're only a centimetre or two out from one end to the other over hundreds of metres. The stones are phenomenally huge, and you just look at that and you think, like, they had copper chisels and they carved granite to perfection. They polished it. The sides of some of the boxes that they carved out of granite to the size of a car. You can stand inside them, and they're so accurate that you can measure the difference in microns. It's just incredible, and I mean incredible in the sense of you cannot believe that. Surely you cannot believe that men with copper chisels carved out huge granite sarcophagi and obelisks and internal circles that are so accurate that we could not carve them even today, and they're huge and they move them hundreds of miles, and supposedly in those days they didn't even know what a wheel was. This is before the discovery of the wheel, but they can build pyramids. I mean, the whole thing just doesn't fit. And so when you start to look at that, you start to think, hang on a sec, there's something wrong here. You just look at a pyramid and you know that it was built by sophisticated people with advanced technology, because we could not build that today. Also, of course, it's the actual monumental size of some of these buildings. The blocks, this is from Lebanon, look at the size of the block, and yet they moved these blocks several miles to form the foundation for a temple, and they did several of these things. There are so many explanations that are offered as to how they would move these, and the way that they would use levers and ropes and pulleys and lots of manpower, and you just think, like, well, why did they do that? It just doesn't make sense. You only do things like this because it's easy to do. And so therefore, although there is no explanation that can be offered that we know of, nevertheless, we know that the explanations that have been offered are just not possible. They just don't fit the archaeological evidence. There are certain things which we can't explain at all, such as the polygonal masonry of South America. But it's not just South America, it's in Turkey, it's in Japan, it's in Europe, it's elsewhere, it's all around the globe. It would appear that there are pieces like this. And I mean, why would you carve stone like that? Surely you would just carve them straight and sit them on top of each other. And it's very interesting when you look at some of these corners, it's quite clear that they've actually sort of melted into each other. When you look at the corner up here, this is quite clearly sort of melted or molded into. I mean, and what is this strange surface that you see on here? Were these rocks melted? If so, how did they create that much heat? Or were they softened by some chemical process? I mean, it's a puzzle. Quite clearly, although we don't understand it, there is evidence that they had technology that we don't have. It's very interesting. One of the features is these nubs, which appear on rocks all over the world, in Asia, in Egypt. In Egypt, there's polygonal masonry, and there's the seal between them is so tight that water can't pass through. You can't even get a piece of paper in between them. And when you look at that, you start to think, like, how come? What are these strange little lumps, these nubs which come out? Was that part of the process? There are lots of puzzles like that. There's also puzzles in the fact that there's precision cuts, which do rather look like they've been cut with a machine. Look at this. This is from a day and age where in Egypt archaeologists will tell us that they didn't even know what a wheel was. They didn't know what a wheel was, but they could make a lathe, and they could carve beautiful vases out of, or they could cut beautiful vases out of very brittle material, which is very difficult to do. And the evidence is all over the place. There are shelffuls of them, and you can go and see them in any local museum. They're here in the Fitzwilliam in Cambridge, they're in the British Museum. There are hundreds of these things, and quite clearly carving things out of stone with a lathe was something that was second nature to the Egyptians. But supposedly they didn't know what a wheel was. Now, how did they not know what a wheel was? It doesn't make sense. Something's wrong with the pattern that we're given. Also, they cut granite supposedly with copper chisels and saws. Now, okay, it is doable if you don't mind sharpening your chisel every 6 cuts. It's doable with a saw as long as you don't mind taking about a week to cut a couple of inches. You can put in grinding agents, carborundum type of grinding agents, and make a grinding paste with sand, and you can slowly cut through, but it's very difficult to be accurate, and it's so slow. Now, okay, time is not necessarily a problem, but according to the historical time scale that's given to us, they built the pyramids in 20 years. Now, they might have had a vast workforce, so there were many people cutting, but it's very difficult to know how they would fit all of those into the one quarry from which all these rocks came in Aswan, the granite. And I look at something like that and I think, as somebody who used to be a carpenter, I look at that and I think somebody was testing their saw there. Somebody was making these cuts to see if it was straight. That just resonates with me as a carpenter. It's where I've sharpened my blade and I'm testing it, or I'm training somebody how to use it. No, do it like this, son, like an apprentice, And so you've made lots and lots of cuts for no apparent reason, because actually what you're doing is just training or showing how to do things. And it looks like there were more cuts marked out, but he'd obviously proven himself, so he had to move on. Now, that's just me surmising, that's just me imagining, but I don't think you'd make lots and lots of cuts like that if it took you a week to go a few inches, because you would be putting a year's worth. There's a year's worth of sawing with a copper saw here, but that looks like somebody just doing something very quickly. It doesn't make sense. It's just not technologically possible. Also, there's evidence that they had drills. This is a borehole. You can see that it's made by a hollow drill, and from the striations or the lines on the inside of the cut, you can see that on each turn this drill was cutting about 2 millimeters. Now, that's not copper. copper wouldn't cut that quickly. This is something that's diamond tipped, something that's powerful, something that's got a lot of pressure on it, and clearly it was something that was able to cut through hard rock very, very quickly. Again, evidence of a saw where supposedly they didn't have saws, and it looks very much like the work of a circular saw as well, which would of course take some kind of technology, gears and things like that. That doesn't necessarily mean that they had power tools, but certainly they had some kind of technology. And there are lots of websites and lots of videos on YouTube that cover this. Very, very few books cover this, because most books are covered by or published by the established archaeological think tanks. This is one of the Ica stones. I love this. This is in South America. There are thousands of these, and when you look at the details on it, you can see accurate portrayals of dinosaurs. And to be honest, I think this looks like a map of the world. On there on the right, is that Africa perhaps? And maybe the two spikes at the bottom are Antarctica or something. We don't know. And then have we got America there in the middle with a narrow place in the middle? And then maybe that's another continent on the other side. Now the thing is that I see all those continents very close together. Now that might have been just to fit them on a stone, but on the other hand, it also fits something which I'm going to talk about, which is the division of the continent. And Pangaea was one continent originally, and it's quite visible when you look at a map. You can see how the African continent split away from America and formed the continents that we know today, with the Atlantic Ocean between them. So it's interesting to see that you've got portrayals of that from thousands of years ago. How do they know the shape of the continents unless they were able to see them from above, or they were able to map them out with latitude and longitude and that kind of stuff? It's a puzzle. Supposedly at this time men didn't know more than their local horizon or their own territory. So how would they know what a continent looked like, and how would they know what animals lived on each continent? Very interesting. Again, the portrayal of dinosaurs is phenomenal. It's quite amazing. Supposedly no man has ever seen dinosaurs. Well, I beg to differ, because somebody drew these and they were quite familiar with the anatomy of these animals, because they're quite accurate. They're quite recognizable for what they are. You can see a pterodactyl, Tyrannosaurus rex, a brontosaurus, triceratops. They're all there, and they're quite accurate. This is from Asia, from one of those temples that you see in the regions of Cambodia and in Vietnam. That looks like a dinosaur to me. I don't know any animal that looks like that apart from dinosaurs, and this was carved just in recent centuries, so somebody has seen them. Also in this temple there's a portrayal of an elephant with 4 tusks, and according to the archaeological establishment, the mammoth or elephant with 4 tusks died out about 2 million years ago. So how on earth would it portray them in these carvings going into battle? Quite a remarkable thought. Okay. And so therefore, we've got this idea that primitive man has developed and leads up to sophisticated man or modern man as we have now. But yet you've got all these OOPARTS which show that pattern just doesn't fit. And it's very difficult to understand why. Now, there are alternative views of history, and I would like to emphasize that these are evidence-based. They're evidence-based. And this is very important, because what it is people try to fit evidence to what they already believe. They believe in evolution, and so they try to fit this in. Whereas in fact, when you actually just come to the evidence and say, look, the evidence is going to tell me what to believe. When I dig up something from the past which is sophisticated, I'm going to say, hey, people in those days were sophisticated. I'm not going to try and explain it away with something else. And there is evidence that there was a cataclysm in the past. Now this is still based, and it starts off, its starting point is still that of an evolutionist, and so therefore they have an early man who was primitive, caveman, Neanderthal. But over a series of millennia, then man becomes sophisticated and you have an advanced civilization with great technology. And it's at this point that they build the pyramids, they have polygonal stonework, they have the ability to fly and see the continents from above, so therefore they're able to map out the continents, and so on and so forth. So you've got a time in history where the pyramids could be built. But then there's a cataclysm, there's a disaster, a catastrophe that wipes out most of humankind. Okay, so there's an extinction level event basically, and so you end up with primitive society again. Now that's not to say that man has become thick again or gone back to being primitive in the sense of being undeveloped, but they've lost their technology. Think of it this way, if I, as a modern man who can use computers and jet planes and cars, was plunged into a situation where things were primitive. For example, I was dumped on a desert island, or if civilization around me was destroyed by an atomic war or a flood, then of course I would not know how to make new things. That's not to say that I've become a primitive man, I'm still the same person, but I don't know how to make iron from iron ore, and so therefore I'm not able to make metal tools. I would be resorting to making clothes out of skins and making tools out of local flint, knives out of stone. And so therefore, it's not to say that man has become less primitive, or more primitive I should say, but he's got less technology, he's less sophisticated. And so that's the idea, that this cataclysm would come, and then man would be reduced to simple lifestyles again. Okay, and there are various theories about this cataclysm, because they can see this in the archaeological record. They talk about meteor strikes, they talk about floods, they talk about earthquakes, they talk about various cataclysmic issues that might have happened. The Younger Dryas is a particular theory, a name given to a particular theory about floods, and they even talk in many circles about before the flood, this advanced civilization that was before the flood, which is interesting because of course as a Bible believing Christian, then you may pick up on that. You might say before the flood, because there's a lot of evidence of a widespread flood around the world, both in terms of cultural folklore and also of course in the archaeology. And then it's after this cataclysm, or after this ice age, as man emerges from that then you have, over thousands of millennia, you have advances through the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. That is the archaeological time scale or paradigm which is accepted by the mainstream archaeological establishment. But you'll notice that it's in addition to that you've got this advanced civilization in the past. Now that's evidence-based, and that's based on people who are not Bible believing and not Christians, and so therefore they're going with the best evidence that they've got, and credit where credit is due, they are basing their ideas on what they see rather than denying what they see or trying to make it fit artificially. All right. However, I would argue that there's no evidence that early man was primitive. The biblical record of history starts off with early man as sophisticated, so you can see our line is right up high. Adam was in fact perfect. He's sophisticated, he's scientific, he's technologically advanced, and that is where man starts. He doesn't have to get to that point, he starts at that point. Okay, and then sin comes in, and so of course something is lost, things are less than perfect, and the Bible describes how things went until the point of the flood, where in fact God says he's grieved that he's made man. But then of course you've got Noah's flood, and most people are aware of that. Even unsaved people and people who are not Christians will have heard of Noah's flood, but they might not have heard of a second disaster which is listed in Genesis 10, because in Genesis 10 it says that the land is divided. Okay, and to my mind that's where the single supercontinent, otherwise known as Pangaea, split with massive earthquakes, and so you've got America splitting away from Africa and so on and so forth around the world, and that's where you end up with the different continents, the different islands, and that's where it started. And in fact, when you actually look at this, you see a lot of people, they talk about the sophisticated civilization that was before the flood in the evidence-based alternative views of history. I understand Noah's flood to be so cataclysmic that there would be no evidence of things left before that. Little bits and pieces, an iron hammer buried in a layer of rock, maybe little bits here and there, but the idea that maybe the pyramids survived the flood, I can't quite see, because I think the flood was so widespread and so cataclysmic that it would have ripped even the pyramids up from the ground, and so there would be no evidence of that at all. However, when the land is divided, you're talking about earthquakes, there would have been tsunamis, there would have been eruptions, volcanic eruptions, all the destruction that you associate with those things, and therefore there would be evidence left in places, because of course they would be relatively localized. If the Atlantic Ocean is formed by a split down the continent which divides Africa from America, then the destruction would be on that side of the planet but not on the other side of the planet, so it would be localized. I say localized as in those sides of the continents, not localized as in sort of like short distance, but I mean we're talking about hundreds of miles, possibly thousands, and so there would be some evidence left even after these things. Okay, and it's just interesting to see that the Bible actually puts all of this within a 6,000 year timescale, not sort of tens of thousands or millions of years, just 6,000 years, and with that you can actually put a date on Noah's flood as being 16 centuries after creation, from Adam, and in fact Genesis 10 is dated within the first 2,000 years, 18 centuries to 20 centuries after creation. And in fact, looking at that in more detail, we could actually understand that perhaps there were a series of cataclysms during that time, that in fact while the land was divided, there would have been a series of cataclysms as these different continents split up and mountain ranges were formed with startling rapidity, with startling speed. And so you see a slightly different point of view there. I understand that everything from before Noah's flood was wiped out, but man was relatively sophisticated after the flood as they spread out, the sons of Shem, Ham and Japheth, and for example it says at that point that they spread to Babel and they built a tower, the Tower of Babel. You may have heard about it, and by the sound of it, it was something like a pyramid. It's during that time that you have the pyramids created. So therefore the people who formed those things, and sometimes they've been associated with Atlantis, given that the ancient Egyptians thought that they were descended from the people of Atlantis. It could be that Atlantis was broken up and wiped out at that time. Maybe we can find some archaeological evidence of that somewhere, but the pyramids might actually be a remnant of that early people, and so therefore they were greatly sophisticated, but then they were wiped out and the technology with which they built the pyramids was destroyed. And likewise for all the other evidences, such as the polygonal stonework of South America and Turkey and Japan, all of them wiped out as they spread out around the world, but then they met with these cataclysms. All right. So actually the alternative point of view on history, which is evidence-based, does agree with the biblical record, and it's very interesting listening to them on YouTube or reading what they've written. It's very interesting. Some of them are very anti-God, and they don't realize that actually they are talking about evidence that supports the Bible, and they are in fact attesting to the fact that the Bible is true. So reaching out to you guys, if you're watching this, if you're one of those people who makes videos but you don't believe in God, you don't realize that when you're talking about the alternative view of history, you are proving that the Bible is quite true. So if you have any questions about that, please write in the comments below. Thank you.